All right, so we talked about war the last class, and I gave you some of the classic just war theory arguments and things like that. And I had alluded a little bit to the book, The Kingdom of Heaven is Within You by Leo Tolstoy. And because he was an absolute pacifist, I mentioned one of the problems was he could not reconcile the God of the Old Testament with God incarnate in the New Testament. And in his mind, he's thinking these are two totally different beings. Unfortunately, that makes his work very problematic for an evangelical fundamentalist audience. But I still think there's great value in his work, especially his idea of non-compliance with violence. Stop being a participant in the oppression of other people. Even if it means the oppression gets put onto you, at least you are not adding to the oppression by oppressing another. So you can at least cut it in half by not participating or not retaliating. And I know it sounds incredibly idealistic, and his wife, Tolstoy's wife, was in terror that he was going to give the family estate away to the peasants and that he wouldn't be there to protect them if something happened and these sorts of things. So he is an extreme case, but he inspired Mahatma Gandhi and with this type of thinking. And even though Gandhi was not a Christian, he was very influenced by Count Leo Tolstoy's The Kingdom of Heaven is Within You. And I'm sure you've all heard the quote. Gandhi said he loved the idea of Christianity, he just had a problem with Christians. That was his problem, was the way Christians were acting it out. And if you look at the content, you have the subcontinent of India being dominated. You have 800 million Indians being dominated and controlled by 500,000 English, or people from Great Britain, the United Kingdom. And Gandhi pointed out, and he was using Tolstoy's precepts, he said, the only way 500,000 people can control 800 million people is by the compliance of the 800 million. And if we would, he wasn't saying we should violently overthrow the British or physically kill or remove them, but simply stop complying with their control of the country, stop cooperating in the oppression. And eventually that led to a non-violent passive overthrow of British rule in India, passive resistance. And then that influenced Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, during the 60s, he was influenced by Gandhi, who was influenced by Tolstoy. So there is a continuum going on. And there were other activist groups like the Black Panthers and others in the 60s. There were even Red Power movements, this idea that we have to get our rights or equality, and if we have to resort to violence to do it, we're going to. But Martin Luther King Jr. said no, because violence begets violence. If we want to get justice and equal opportunity and rights, we need to get white America in particular, in this instance, to see the problem and the oppression. But if they see us out there armed and throwing rocks and burning down buildings, it's just going to reinforce the fears they have of the Black American community. But he said, if we can show peaceful protest and the media will show the assaults being taken on peaceful protesters, like being hosed down with fire hoses, or German Shepherd dogs being sicked on school children, or these sorts of images began to really affect the white American mentality. And they're like, oh my God, is this actually going on still in the United States, where a lot of people who weren't living, especially in a Southern context at that time, weren't aware. At least white America wasn't aware. And seeing those images of oppression and violence against peaceful protesters eventually turned the national consciousness and help bring about civil rights legislation. So that's just one example of how pacifism can be. It doesn't mean you're passive and you don't do anything. As you know, Martin Luther, he went King Jr. He went to jail. He did marches. He did interventions. He talked to Congress. He wasn't just sitting there hoping the violence would stop. He was very active in his nonviolent approach. So I just wanted to wrap up that talk on war with that. And I mentioned the same proof text, and I cautioned you about using proof text. Look for the whole context of scripture when we're looking at these issues. But this leads naturally into a discussion onto capital punishment. And first of all, would someone like to define that for me? What is capital punishment? Try to get some conversation in here. Anybody know what capital punishment is? Okay, let's back up a step then. Let's have a brief discussion on what is the difference between punishment and discipline. This is the key factor for this issue for me personally. The difference between punishment and discipline. Okay, I'm not getting a lot of talkers today, which is fine.
Punishment.
Oh, there we go, Alfred.
Yeah, just you're punished for not doing something right, and it's just, it's just like a way. So like, what type of punishment would you talk about? Like, would it be violent, like something physical, compared to like discipline and just like, all right, you're expected to do this right, or you're just not gonna. We're gonna take some rights from you. I don't know how to explain that one.
Okay. Well, you could discipline or punish using violence. So it's not necessarily a violence issue. It's more of an intention issue.
I don't know then.
What is the difference of intention when you punish someone and when you discipline someone?
For me, what I think it is that for discipline, it's kind of like correcting a behavior and like kind of like shifting someone back into line, whereas
Perfect.
Punishment is trying to stop that behavior.
Right. So that's really good, Francisco. So discipline has the intention of correcting behavior. And I believe God, it's quite clear in the scriptures that God does discipline his children. But I do not think you will find anywhere in scripture where God punishes his children. I'm talking New Testament, people who have the Holy Spirit. Yes, God is our Father. He disciplines us for our benefit and our good. So the intention is correction. Punishment, God also does punish, but I do not believe he punishes believers. But punishment is about retribution. It's about paying back. So for example, raising my kids, if my nephew was up playing video games late all night and I was having a hard time getting them up for school in the morning, I could discipline him and say, look, you made me late to school by a half hour, so I'm going to make you late for your baseball practice this afternoon by a half hour. That's like a tit for a tat, an eye for an eye, a blow for a blow. Discipline, I could still impose maybe some sort of limitation or curfew on him, but it might be more expedient to say, you know what, I noticed you were having a problem managing your time, so tonight you're not going to be able to play your video games past 9 p.m. or something like that on a school night. And I'm doing it because I love him. I want him to function. I want him to be able to manage his time. Where the other is, you made me late, I'm going to make you late. You broke my stuff, I'm going to break your stuff. You were disrespectful to me, I'm going to be disrespectful to you. That is punishment and retaliation, making people pay for what they did. Discipline is trying to correct behavior. And at least in God's discipline for us, it's because he cares for us and loves us. All right. Now, taking those definitions, this is part of why I personally have such a problem with capital punishment, especially as advocated or practiced by Christians. Once again, Romans 13 makes it quite clear that governing authorities have that power. I don't think there's any way hermeneutically around that. Talking about the government is not given the sword in vain, but they are executors and revengers of the wrath of God, basically. Capital punishment is the ultimate punishment. It means putting someone to death. Okay, so we don't have capital discipline, we have capital punishment, because you're not trying to correct their behavior, you're simply punishing them for what they have done. And so that's my first problem with capital punishment. How can we, who have been forgiven an eternal death or separation from God, then turn around and hold other human beings accountable for temporal death? And I think it's completely incompatible. And if you're familiar with the story of the unjust steward, this account in the Bible, it's a parable in the Bible where this steward owed this unpayable debt to his master. And when the master found out, he says, basically, you're going to go to prison until the debt is paid, which meant you're going to be in prison the rest of your life. And he begged his master and he said, please have mercy. I don't have any way to pay it back. And the master forgave his debt completely. Then that same steward went out that same day and found someone that owed him a pittance and told him, I'm going to have you thrown into jail if you don't pay me back. And when that person asked for mercy, none was shown. And when the master found out that the person he had forgiven would not forgive another, he threw that unjust steward into prison. And I think that's such a great illustration. I mean, think of the Lord's Prayer. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. If we are not willing to forgive others, how do we expect God's forgiveness to be in our own lives? And so these are kind of my major concerns when we talk about capital punishment in the context of Christian living or Holy Spirit-led living. I think it's interesting. You'll find the Roman Catholic position has been consistently anti-capital punishment for quite some time now, part of their moral philosophy. And once again, it makes sense when you look at it in terms of natural law theory. This idea that right to life is a basic life. Now, forfeiture could allow for capital punishment, just like it could allow for just war theory or just war doctrine. But how much better to be in a place of forgiveness. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying that we should let murderers or rapists or torturers or people with these heinous, violent crimes just roam our streets and cities free without any accountability or protection of society. But it's one thing to incarcerate someone, and it's another thing to terminate their life. And I have really strong views about the taking of life. And I don't care if, I mean, I do care about human life, but that would even extend to like animals to me. I do not just want, even insects. I don't just kill bugs or animals because I can or because they're annoying. Because I cannot create life, I am very hesitant to take it. Now, there may be times I take life so that I can live, so that I can eat. I talked about in environmental issues, some of that giveaway idea of Native Americans, but I think that's part of what formulates my opinion. Now, the book I used to use with Norman Geisler, he tried to break this down into three. Can you guys see the whiteboard? I'm trying to learn how to use this whiteboard. I have Old Testament restoration written down, biblical retributionism, and rehabilitationism. And his idea was, I think the reason he had three positions was to try to make his middle position of biblical retributionism seem more biblical. Old Testament restorationism was this idea that we should reinstate the 21 capital crimes listed in the Old Testament. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with this list, but it goes from everything from killing another person to death by negligence. Like we mentioned, like if you had a bull that you knew would gore other people or animals, or a rabid dog and it got out and it hurt or killed someone, the owner would be accountable for those actions. So that would include first-degree murder, and we would, in our culture, we would call it manslaughter or negligence. Where was I in this thought process? Okay, so in the biblical restorationism, all of those, like life for a life laws, but even things like burning unfamiliar incense in the temple could get you killed. And you're just thinking, holy cow, this is quite a list. Or being disrespectful to your parents could get you drug outside the camp and stoned with stones. When we get to the New Testament, however, and we have Christ's sacrifice for all of our sins, reconciling us to God, I find it inappropriate in a Christian context to then go through and try to apply these Old Testament capital punishments to other human beings. Would anyone like to comment or talk about any of that so far? I honestly don't know anyone that wants to reinstate the Mosaic laws in this country. At least I personally don't know anyone. And I know some pretty good legalists, but no one that wants to go that far. It would be equivalent to imposing like Sharia law in our society, if you can imagine. All right. So I think that was an unrealistic thing, like I said, just to make his middle position seem more tenable. On the other end of the spectrum, he kind of bags on this idea of rehabilitationism. And this was very popular in the 70s. And the idea was criminals aren't evil per se, but they're ignorant, kind of like Aristotle's ethic, the idea that knowledge is good, ignorance is evil. And if only we could retrain or re-educate these people, we could fix what was broken and then release them back into society. What ended up happening was we ended up getting a society with more educated criminals to a large degree. And if you look at the recidivism rate of people who had committed crimes and then are incarcerated again and again and again, Geisler had a lot to make fun of, or to say this does not work. And so that brings him to his middle position, where he believed capital punishment should be applied for only a select number of capital crimes. And currently, and I'm willing to be corrected or updated, in my understanding, there are only 3 capital crimes in America today. One is for first-degree murder, and that is murder where you intentionally killed someone, you made a plan, and you followed through. This isn't a crime of passion. This isn't an accident. This is a premeditated, plan-based, intentional killing of another human being. That can get you a death sentence in this country. The second is for treason, and it makes sense, right? And you do not have to be in the military to commit treason. You could be working for a tech company and selling tech or military secrets to Russia or China or some other country, and you could be charged with a capital crime because that information you're giving could actually threaten your own nation's security and sovereignty, and it could cost perhaps hundreds of thousands of lives. And so your life is forfeit for giving or sharing that type of information. And then the third that I'm aware of is they actually made a law having to do with our own airport here, who was named after Lindbergh, the first person, I believe, to sail or to fly across the Atlantic in an airplane. And he was like an American celebrity. They had a small son, and the son was kidnapped. And during this kidnapping, the child ended up dying. Even though the kidnappers were just looking for ransom, their intention wasn't to kill the child. The nation was so outraged that they passed a law that if you kidnap someone and they died while you had them, or even if they were trying to escape, right, and they ended up falling or jumping off a building and killing themselves, in essence, you were still culpable for their death because you kidnapped them. And that would be a capital crime. And so those are the only three I'm aware of. There might be a couple exceptions for like really gross torture or mutilations, but I'm a little fuzzy on that one. But those three I know. And Geisler says that's expedient, that's what we should hold to, and those are biblical grounds for capital punishment. And once again, I don't argue with the justice of it. It's absolutely just. If you take a life, your life is forfeit. What else could you possibly pay? You can't pay money, you can't pay time, you can't replace a life except with a life. The problem, of course, is taking another life does not bring that person back that was killed. And so do we want to end up taking two lives as a just solution? Or do we want to treat those who have inflicted homicide on another in a different way? And once again, just because we forgive someone or give them grace or mercy does not mean there are not consequences for their activities. But are the consequences going to be from a point of discipline or a point of punishment? That's where I'm at in my own head. And I don't care if that's capital punishment or corporal punishment. I don't believe either are appropriate for Christians. Thoughts, comments on that? There is something about retribution that really appeals to our human nature. I mean, my all-time favorite action or war movies involve retribution, right? I take Braveheart, for example. My people are Scots-Irish. I could get all into the history and the bagpipes getting my blood up and all of that. But that wasn't a movie about Scottish independence or freedom or anything else. It was about payback because of what happened to William Wallace's wife. And he wanted blood for blood. He wanted pain for pain. And I get it. And we, in our flesh, I think that's a very natural response. My favorite all-time Western, The Outlaw Josie Wales, same story. This Southern man has his wife and child killed by Northerners, and he isn't invested in the South or the Confederacy or any of that ideology. He simply wants a life for a life, blood for blood, because of what happened. And the whole movie is him executing vengeance upon the people that harmed him and his. So I get the sentiment, I get the appeal, but I do not believe that is coming from the Spirit. I believe that is coming from the works of the flesh. Thoughts, comments? I think Biden is our first president that is an anti-capital punishment president that I'm aware of. And so I do not expect that you will be seeing any federal executions during his time as president, because he can always either provide clemency or he can postpone, or I think even cancel an execution without even giving someone a full pardon. I think that's within his power. Just like a state executions, the governor has the power to stop an execution or stay in execution. Now, there are utilitarian arguments for and against capital punishment. That's not how I'm wanting to make my decisions, but I'm not saying they're not valid. Some people would argue It's a deterrent. If people know if I take a life, my life is forfeit, that is going to deter a lot of people from committing murder. And I'm not saying that is not a legitimate case, but that means you have to carry out capital punishment. It can't just be on the books. It has to be something you're actively engaged in. I did pull up a stat earlier today. I just wanted to check out which states performed the most capital punishments. And it was quite interesting. I believe Texas was in the lead by far with over the last, I don't know, I think I looked over the last 25 years, and it looked like they had done a little over 500 capital punishments in the last 500 years. But almost all the states still participating in capital punishment are in the South or Southern states, with a couple exceptions. California, I'm surprised, as progressive as California is, on our last election, there was overwhelming support for capital punishment, even in California. Of course, there has not been someone put to death in California by the state in, I believe, over a decade. Actually, if someone wants to Google that for me, I'd be curious when the last execution took place in California. So we do have many people on death row in California. We do have capital punishment on the books, but the Democratic-led legislature and the Democratic governor have been anti-capital punishment. And as long as they've been in power, there hasn't been any executions, as far as I know. The reverse, of course, can happen. If you know, if you saw any of those movies where people kind of run amok and they may have intentionally or accidentally killed someone, but once they realize they've killed someone, it's like there's no going back. And sometimes people will just go on a rampage because there's no redemption, there's no chance of forgiveness, there's no chance of parole. It's, I'm going to be executed, so I'm going to go down in flames. And so that can be a problem. Another issue I have is the inequality in which capital punishment is applied in this country. When you look at the percentage of minorities on death row or that are executed compared to the majority ethnicity, it's problematic. Now, you can conclude different things. Minorities are more violent, or there's injustice in the justice system, or inequality in the justice system. And I'm sure you could find the sources to make your case for either point, but I think that's really interesting. The other problem is with advanced DNA testing and forensics is they have been revisiting a lot of cases, especially people on death row revisiting their cases, and many have been exonerated. And it shows that they were not the person that committed the crime. And you know, how many people have been executed that were unfairly tried? And that's one of those things you can't do a do-over, or you can't do a take back. At least if you didn't kill them and put them in life in prison, they would have a chance of being released and probably restitution from the state. But once you've killed someone, that's kind of the end of their story. So I think the only exception I could personally think of for capital punishment is if someone actually asked to die, almost like a type of euthanasia or mercy killing, where they could not live with their guilt or what they had done, and they simply wanted their life to end, and whether that be through public execution or what have you. Okay, thoughts, comments, questions? I thought we would have more activity with me at home, but apparently not. Okay. Well, let me just say one more thing about discipline and punishment. And I'm not even talking about capital punishment or corporal punishment. With corporal punishment would be like spankings or beatings or things of that nature. I just think it's very important that as we're trying to teach people or model for our children, that we do it in a way that isn't contradictory or confusing. I'll never forget when my oldest nephew, I think he was like 4, and he had gone up and bonked one of his brothers or sisters in the head. And my father got out the belt or paddle or whatever he was using and gave him a couple swats on the butt. And my dad did that to try to show him that hitting wasn't okay. And my little 4-year-old nephew took his fat little finger and pointed at my dad and said, "Hitting, not okay," as he was being spanked. And so I don't know if he was getting the message or if he was calling my dad out on, "You're trying to get me to stop hitting people by hitting me." There's like a mixed message going on there. And so if we're not going to advocate for violence, we can't use violence to stop violence, would be part of the condition there. My nephew came from, basically he came to live with me when he was 11, and he came from a pretty rough and tumble household where there was a lot of physical punishment, and I would say abuse. And so I kind of committed, even though I'm not completely opposed to physical discipline. For him, he had already suffered so much. I wanted to be much more creative in the ways that I disciplined him. And I wanted to be educational, not just, you knocked over my coffee cup, so you get the back of my hand, or you didn't do your chores, so you're going to get a spanking. Or I did not want to resort to physical disciplinary techniques. So I would have him write me little essays, or I would have him do little work projects in the yard, or I would have him do some sort of activity that tried to discourage the behavior I didn't want to see in him and promote and encourage what I thought was healthy and good behavior. Many times when I was giving him a lecture or a writing assignment, he would just say, "Please, Uncle, just hit me," just hit me. And he just wanted to get the physical retribution and get it over with and on with his life. But that is not what I thought was in his best interest or what he needed at that time. And so it's kind of a holistic approach for me, and why I wanted to start this talk with what's the difference between punishment and discipline. We discipline those we love and care about. Punishment, retribution, is simply a payback. Revenge, retribution. And that passage from Matthew 5 I showed you made it quite clear that should not be how Christians are responding to those who have offended us in word, deed, or physical violence. All right, well, I'm not going to drag this out. I finally got my first request for an ethical dilemma, and it's a doozy. Thanks, Elijah. He wants to talk about transgender issues, and I am more than happy to do that, and we can do that on on Tuesday at 12:30. I'll be here, but I'd like to start with human sexuality as a broad topic, and then we'll work it down to transgender issues. But I think it would be better to start with a big umbrella of biblical views of human sexuality, and then we can go down into like homosexuality, and then we can just go right through the LGBTQ spectrum and talk about different scenarios. And I know this is going to become a real issue for a lot of you, whether you're a teacher or in ministry or whatever you're doing. How do you navigate with people who have different ideas about gender or sexual attraction, or things that seem to violate your biblical norms or standards? And what should be our proper response to them, and even to ourselves and our own community? So we'll do that on Monday. And then I still have 2 days open for issues. So if you got anything you want to talk about, I'm more than open to it. All right. Well, you guys have a good weekend, and I will see you guys on Tuesday. All right.